Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. This is our Friday weekend edition, and we have a number of guests here, as we oftentimes do, that bring a lot of expertise. First of all, Debbie Georgatos, who is a lawyer, host of America Can We Talk, and an author. And you've had a lot to talk about the last couple of days, but we're going to certainly get into it today, aren't we?
Can hardly wait.
Nothing else. It's a good show prep for anything that you learned this week, and we can apply on your show next week. And Dr. Merrill Matthews, of course, is with us, and he is the resident scholar for the Institute for Policy Innovation. And Dr. Merrill Matthews, always great to have you here.
Thank you.
And by the way, we have a lot of articles by you individuals. One, Dr. Merrill Matthews, Destroying the Healthcare System to Save It. And, of course, we have the whole question about coronavirus immunity cards by Debbie Georgatos. I have one by your husband, Eric. I think we have two by Eric and a lot of others. So along the way, we can certainly do this. But Dr. Matthews, just before we got on the air, you were reminding me of an article that you had in The Hill a couple of weeks ago that generated a lot of response. And it was where you were suggesting that even when President Donald Trump thought that maybe we could begin opening up the country by Easter, that maybe that wouldn't happen, but that's not far off. And you did receive a few calls and comments, didn't you?
I did indeed. In fact, the primary point on that was that I said there are a lot of studies coming out talking about the death rates and so forth, some cases in the millions in the U.S. And I said, count me as skeptical of some of these worst case scenarios. And then at the end, I pointed out, I said, it's going to be slow coming back. The president wants us back by Easter. I don't think I said it exactly like this, but we may not make that, but it may not be that far off. We're looking at that point. You were looking at sort of May, and of course, 1 week after Easter, several of the states are starting to gradually open back up. But my goodness, you should have seen. I didn't know I had to get my dictionary out for some of the words.
And there were some words we will not say on the air.
I had to send a note to some women saying, "Excuse me, you're talking to a gentleman. Would you please be?"
It is unbelievable, the responses, and I'm going to leave a lot of the conversation about Georgia to the next hour because, by that time, you better get your shots in, because last time I brought that up a day or two ago, I guess it was 2 days ago, the phones just go, boop, everybody in Georgia wants to talk about Governor Kemp, so we'll get into that a little bit later. But many of the people listening right now in the state of Texas, but Debbie Georgatos, you've been collecting some horror stories even right here in the state of Texas, haven't you?
Absolutely true. It's amazing because people around the country think Texas is kind of the leader of liberty. We're the ones that stand up for liberty. But we do have, and where this program is located is Dallas County. So we have the county level regulations from the county judge and then the state of Texas. And Texas people thought would be among the first to open up, and they are kind of slowly beginning to do that. But county regulations, and I think this is true throughout the country, county officials and mayors are the source of many more draconian, to the overused word these days, kind of orders. In Texas in particular, we had the issue of I was mentioning before we got started, a woman who was outside in her own front yard playing the harp, which, of course, you hear stories about people singing together. They're singing, hymns or just doing positive things, playing her harp, neighbors standing outside going, wow, this sounds really nice. And somehow that was a violation of some aspect of our county judge's order, and she was given a citation and fine. I'm still digging into that story and to figure out what exactly the fine or citation was for, and I hope that she will challenge it. But yeah, there are a lot of overly empowered. Some people who are involved in law enforcement get a little overexcited in enforcing some of these orders, and some of the county judges' orders, I think, are probably not constitutional according to the Texas Constitution.
Next hour when we also, if we just even mention the name Gretchen Whitman or Michigan, all the Michigan calls in as well from our listeners there. But let's keep it, first of all, to recognize that New York is an outlier. This is unfortunately a screen capture. I don't know why Dr. Deborah Birx, who put that on the screen last Friday, didn't have it somewhere else. But for those of you watching online for just a minute, let me hold it up here because it shows the top 25 metro areas. And this red line is New York City, which has just been an incredible hotspot. But as you can see from this, and if you're watching online, you can see the other 24 metro areas just hug the X-axis. And it kind of relates back to a Dennis Prager piece. Dennis Prager said, if half the country's deaths were in Montana, would New York shut down? So it gets us back to this whole issue. One size does not fit all. Dallas County is not Collin County. Dallas is not New York. Certainly Augusta, Georgia is not Atlanta, Georgia, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And it seems to me that's part of the danger, isn't it?
It is, and I'll mention it was a great article, and I'm sorry, I'm not sure if you had that or talked about this on your show, but a gentleman did a study of the counties that are considered downstate New York. And if you take the number of deaths in downstate New York as compared with the rest of the country and put them on a chart compared to other countries, so you're talking about the number of infections per million and then deaths per million as a statistic. If you take downstate New York and pretend it was its own country, is number one in the world for infections per million in the world. Just those counties, if it were a country. And America, if you take the rest of America, leaving out downstate New York, doesn't even make the top 10. And so really, it's it's tragic, it's sad, it's a lot of factors. People can explain why this happened, but downstate New York has an extreme and unique problem.
Well, let's focus on that for just a minute, because you're originally from the state of New York.
Yes.
And we have this piece by Heather McDonald. Everybody knows who she is. And she pointed out that the day after, again, the Governor Cuomo, announced a moratorium, you had people from Jefferson, Lewis, Oswego, and St. Louis counties, and they have about 361,000 people. But again, they only had 232 coronavirus cases, a handful of hospitalizations, and one death. And so they were asking a very good question. Why were upstate counties, upstate New York, I go there every year, subject to the same restrictions as New York City? And, of course, I don't think you can answer that question because, again, it's just a good illustration. You've lived in New York City and recognize New York City is different than New York State, and upstate is different than, downstate. Explain that.
It is. New York City, as I always happily say, they live on top of each other, and they're bragging about that. They love being so densely populated. But New York City had a unique problem because they had numerous flights in and out of Wuhan, China, into New York City. That is just a problem. Before we realized what the problem was, that brought a lot of the problem in. They kept the subway open. I think it might still be open in New York City. Just a petri dish of spreading things in this before they realized what the problem was. I am very sympathetic for everyone in New York and New York City, and I would like this whole episode to be behind us. But unique factors in New York City contributed to the explosion of the problem there before we were really on top of it. And they have to deal with their problem in a unique way as contrasted with upstate New York, which has, as you're saying, Kerby, very little of a problem.
Let's take a break. When we come back, I want to talk with Dr. Merrill Matthews, the first article we've posted here, Destroying the Healthcare System to Save It, which reminds me a little bit of, remember George W. Bush, I've got to violate the free market to save the free market. It reminded me of that a little bit. It certainly reminded Kelly Shackelford when he saw that because he uses that quote all the time. So we'll try to explain why some of these hospitals, even in the state of Texas, are almost going bankrupt, why individuals that are doctors and clinics and others are having so much difficulty and hemorrhaging cash. Dr. Merrill Matthews will explain that, and that's also part of that lockdown. So we'll talk about those issues right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Ramadan begins today. It is the holy month of fasting for Muslims. But you may have noticed that Ramadan seems to be a time of increased attacks on infidels. Every year, the death toll runs into the hundreds. I fear this year the statistics will also be grim. At first, this seems like a contradiction. Ramadan occurs during the 9th lunar month in the Islamic calendar. It is a time when Muslims fast from their first prayer in the morning to their fourth prayer after sunset. They also refrain from all sorts of activities and focus their minds on fervent prayer. Ramadan is a holy month, so why all the violence? One of my regular guests on radio is Dr. Jim Dennison. He explains that Muslims believe that they will receive greater rewards during this month on the Islamic calendar. Muhammad himself actually preached a sermon on Ramadan in which he said, "Whoever performs an obligatory deed in this month shall receive the reward of performing 70 obligations at any other time." One Taliban spokesman therefore proclaimed, "Our fight is jihad and an obligatory worship, and even obligatory act of worship has 70 times more reward in Ramadan." So I guess it's not surprising that jihadists use this month to maximize their rewards. Each attack is different. A gunman stormed a casino in Manila. Attackers killed more than 24 Coptic Christians traveling on a bus in Egypt. A suicide attack in Kabul destroyed the embassy, and attackers in London drove over pedestrians and then stabbed others after leaving the vehicle. Ramadan begins today. Let us pray that it will end without the usual violence that has been part of it in the past. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, it is our weekend edition. Debbie Georgatos and Dr. Merrill Matthews with us. We will have more that we will talk about later about America Can We Talk and IPI.org, some great resources that you need to have access to. But the first article, Dr. Matthews, is, of course, destroying the healthcare system to save it. And people have heard us mention this a little bit because you ask, how can hospitals be overwhelmed and then be forced to lay off healthcare workers and providers? I've got a commentary coming out, I guess it's on April 29th, about hospital bankruptcies. But this is one of those unintended consequences that is devastating hospitals, doctors, and clinics right now.
Right. And if you're listening to the news, you get the impression the healthcare system is overwhelmed. Here in Dallas, they've talked about we need volunteers to come down and help with the hospitals and do other things like that. But then you look at the stories, and I point out, hospitals are laying off thousands of people. Tenet Hospital laying off thousands of people, I think 3,200 people nationwide. Other hospitals are laying people off. Hospitals may go into bankruptcy. And you're thinking, and physicians' offices are either may go into bankruptcy or hoping a hospital system or somebody will buy them out. Well, if we're having a pandemic that is supposed to overload the healthcare system, how does that happen? And the point is, most of the governors have said elective surgeries and other things, those are off. Hospitals tend to make most of their money on that type of thing. And so you're having an awful lot of hospitals, doctors' offices. I know some doctors. They're putzing around in their yard right now because they can't go in and take care of patients. It's an amazing thing. So I think the media have given us a notion that some systems that healthcare systems are overwhelmed. Some are. New York and Chicago, Detroit, and Louisiana, I think, maybe New Orleans are struggling under it. But the large majority of the country, vast majority of the country, I think, are able to handle their COVID-19 patients if they have any at all. And so I'm just puzzled by what we're seeing in the media, because you've got some of the bailout money coming up from Congress is for hospitals because they're losing so much revenue.
Yes. I want to talk about that in just a minute, because I do know that Debbie's going to have some comments about the Paycheck Protection Program. But let's stay on your column for another minute or two, because first of all, there's the financial issue.
Mm-hmm.
You know, these doctors and hospitals are not actually getting the income because a lot of their revenue stream comes from the elective surgeries. But when you postpone hernia repairs, colonoscopies, knee replacements, including yours, I think, you know, if we want to just get personal here, that's number one. But then there's also the health care issue, because some of these individuals are not getting mammograms, colonoscopies,
exactly.
getting cancer checks.
I have a friend who was scheduled for a colonoscopy, and that was canceled. So he's not gotten that, and there's no reason to think he has a problem. But if he did, and then, of course, you have others, cancer treatments that are being postponed or not having follow-ups and other things of that nature. And then the mental health issue is a big one. We're seeing a rise in spousal abuse complaints. We're seeing there may be child abuse complaints and other things because people are stuck at their home, and people cannot get to their mental health people. And so here in Texas, the National
Alliance of Mental Health,
said their calls to their people are up 300%.
There you go,
tripled over this time.
And we used an example the other day from some of our listeners in Kentucky, where in these areas there were more suicides than there were people that were even contracting COVID-19, much less dying of it. So you can see that the deaths of despair have continued on, and this is just a very significant issue. So that is the first article. But we did talk about the Paycheck Protection Program. Let me give Debbie Georgatos an easy question. Do you think now they finally actually passed it yesterday in the House of Representatives, do you think anybody was playing politics with that whole piece of legislation?
I can't believe you said that. You know, it is the most amazing thing where we had this astonishing level of, just kinds of numbers that people don't even understand. The 2.2 trillion, people can't really, and not myself included, you can't even picture how much money that was. All sorts of money going into the alleged relief bills that were not related to dealing with the exact problem being created by the shutdown, which was caused by the virus. So instead of just bailing out business owners, small business owners, people who have to have to protect paychecks, we have a bunch of frivolous payments, things I think we talked about in the show before, right? My show for sure, the NPR, other things. And yet, for some reason, there was a very dragged out, in fact, opposition seemingly from the left about getting this exact provision done, which was what would really directly address the problem caused by the shutdown, which is paycheck protection.
So again, maybe that's one of those examples of never let a serious crisis go to waste.
Boy, howdy.
Some kind of
way
leverage
down that
and those
path.
kind of things. But
Yes.
this has taken a while. I mean, you have, first of all, the other day we had Representative Van Taylor on the program, and we talked about the fact that this had been postponed by many people call her Ice Cream Nancy now. I don't know.
Yes. Why'd they say that?
But anyway, this has been postponed for that. But then there's a bigger issue because with that money, there was an incentive for banks to really help the bigger businesses because they get 3% of that. So the first people to the government trough were these big businesses that probably didn't need it. The president tried to actually shame Harvard's university because of their endowment. But you have all these small businesses, some of these small churches, nonprofits that are going, hey, what about me? And they're waiting for the next infusion of cash, and that got postponed weeks, didn't it?
Sure did. And I will venture a little bit of a political calculation. I think that as to the fall elections in November 2020, the best thing that Donald Trump had to run on was look at this economy. And he could have from small businesses to people who had jobs in small businesses, people who found jobs in larger businesses. You had a humming economy that was just irrefutable. There was no argument from the left. They could nitpick about whether a precise figure was correct, but there are people who are suspicious about why the left is not wanting to dedicate most of the money in the bailouts to the effort to keep these businesses afloat while we get through the bridge over this crisis. And the notion that it's a fabulous election issue for the left if they can say, well, the economy is gone and Donald Trump handled this crisis poorly. So there is suspicion that the delay in the Paycheck Protection Act, delay in other things that the left seem to have been delaying really were contributing or helping them in the fall elections, give them weaken President Trump's argument about his the great economy and strengthen their own notion that we are the better leaders. He didn't know what he was doing. Vote for us. We can fix it. So I don't like being cynical, and that sounds like a very cynical thing to say, but that's exactly what I think happens. I think the left ultimately will benefit from the longer the economy is in ruins, so the farther we go along, the more we may end up with real damage to President Trump's reelection chances.
And I think that's completely fair. One of the other things that to counterbalance that, I'm looking at Michigan, I'm looking at Wisconsin, I'm looking at protesters out there pushing back against the governors and their restrictions, and I'm thinking to myself, the question had been, could Democrats win back Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania? And if they can in the presidential election, they probably end up taking the election. On the other hand, if Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania are saying, we are opposed to these, you're pressing us too hard, Donald Trump's trying to release this a little bit and get us back going, it may work in his favor, especially with blue collar voters. And this is white collar voters who are office workers. Many of them are able to do some of their work at home. Blue collar laborers, service sector people, and so forth. These lower income people, these are the ones that are being hit hardest by this. And if they end up moving in mass onto Trump because he's at least trying to get them back to work, that might work better for him.
Love that point.
Yeah, and again, other point real quickly is just that idea that if you are actually fairly wealthy, you'll probably be able to make do. So when the governor of New York or the governor in Michigan makes it sound like, well, this is just dollars or the economy versus lives, but you're forgetting about the lives of individuals. I've got one individual in my Sunday school class that says, I have some food in the refrigerator. That's all I've got. I've been furloughed. Where do you go for your next dollar when you're not getting paid? And, of course, we will come back and talk about the fact that actually not getting paid, the unemployment benefits are actually greater than somebody would have imagined. I would just love to watch, to use a biblical phrase, her countenance change when we talk about this. But we'll come back and talk about some of those issues and also the second article that you can be reading ahead. This is by our friend Heather McDonald, The Deadly Cost of Extended Shutdown Orders, and how the decision is now not based upon the freedom of the individuals or the Constitution. In this case, it's based on a matrix that the governor put together to determine how important your business is to society and how safely you can operate. I didn't see that in the Constitution, so we'll come back and talk about those issues. And if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We've got a very long list of articles that you can read today. We've already talked about the one by Dr. Merrill Matthews. We have the one by Heather McDonald. We're going to get to some also by Debbie Georgatos and others. All of that coming up right after these important messages.
"2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation. If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. David Georgatos, Merrill Matthews with us today. And the second article we've posted by Heather McDonald goes into a lot of detail, but I thought I'd focus just on one aspect of that. I'll have a lawyer here talk about this for just a minute, and that is you would assume that a lot of decisions being made would be based upon our liberty. Now, there's a tension right now between liberty and safety. Got that. But it is interesting that Governor Andrew Cuomo, I guess I'm kind of beating him up today, but he's the example.
Yeah, he got it coming.
Is
right.
that I have put together kind of a matrix for deciding which businesses will be allowed to open. First of all, I didn't know he had that kind of authority, but I guess he thinks he does. And he says, first of all, we'll look at how important is the business to society? How essential is it? Number two, how safely can the business operate? And Heather McDonald makes the case, which I'm sure everybody around the table would agree, it's not the role of the state bureaucrat to decide how essential an enterprise is. That is a judgment for consumers to make to its employees, and every business is essential. And so we are back to what is essential, what is not, what is necessary for our society. And I just don't see any of that in the Constitution or even in the state constitutions. And yet individuals are exerting a great deal of authority, aren't they?
They sure are. One thing I've talked about, and I really think should be considered as we go forward, is do we need to look at in our states remedying or examining what emergency authority governors have or any elected official has at the state level? What are the parameters, and what is the process of review? Is there a petition process or some process available to challenge what they've done in an adversarial proceeding that says we the people don't agree, and put the burden back on the government at some point? It's different if they say tornado coming in, shelter in place, or stay off Route 20 because it's flooded. That's emergency. But when it's long-term like this, I think there has to be some process woven into the state legislatures and state law that permits some review. But to the points that Heather is always writes a brilliant article. She's always great. I like the concept of talking more about trusting the people and the idea that individuals, every day, even before coronavirus came along, some people are pretty darn unworried about health, and they don't spend a lot of time worrying if it's flu season, should I stay home? Other people are very cautious. They're either germophobic or they are just a more cautious person. They're senior. They have other kind of health challenges. But the whole notion that we've embraced here is the government can decide when it's safe to go out. And we don't really care what the people think or whether you individually think you are okay with assuming the risk. I have a good friend who never goes out during flu season because she has immune issues. I don't even get the flu shot. Don't tell anybody. I don't even get the flu shot. I go out. But there has to be something reintroduced, even in this pandemic, that an element of the thinking, which is trusting the people and allowing them to take a risk, even if other people wouldn't.
And, we were talking about Governor Cuomo, and, of course, he's on the left. And I get the sense from the media stories I hear, it sort of makes me think people on the left are being more rigorous, let's say, in some of these things. I went and looked at some assessments from the states, and it doesn't seem to appear that way. I mean, anecdotally, it feels like that. But then I also thought here in Dallas County, you had a vote by the commissioners on whether or not to extend the deadline to the middle of May. The county judge, liberal, and then two others, but John Wiley Price, excuse me, who's a liberal, was for opening it up. He represents the south part of Dallas, lower income, typically minority, African American, along with the one conservative on the county. Then I looked over at Rahm Emanuel. There's a story now. Rahm Emanuel, former mayor of of Chicago, a liberal, is in a tiff with his brother Ezekiel Emanuel, who's a medical doctor, says we need to keep this country shut down. Rahm says he's a liberal. He says we need to open these cities back up and get them moving again. So even my sense is that the left likes this and likes and somewhat enjoys imposing these restrictions. I'm just having trouble finding. That's anecdotal. Right. But when you go out and you look, you find out that there's some people on the left who are saying we need to get the economy moving again.
And again, a good example of that is you look at these states today, which we'll talk about more in the next hour, that are opening. Most of them are Republican governors, but you have Colorado,
Right.
Democratic governor.
Right.
So you always have an outlier, but you see a kind of a trend there as well. And if nothing else, this will get a smile from both of you. How many people could tell you what the name was of the county judge in Dallas, or who is the county judge of, say, Collin County? I think everybody knows who it is right now. So it illustrates, again, back to the point you're making, Debbie. That is, do we have some kind of recourse? Because I had somebody on the other day who has said, I always have been a fan of the governor, and when he was in the state of Texas saying we're going to be real careful about what we do, I was applauding him. 2 days later, all of a sudden, I said, wait a minute, he's using this order that comes when you use it for a hurricane to justify closing down the entire state. So in some respects, people are grasping at anything they can to use as an emergency order, and there's never any chance for checks and balances. So I think that's something we need to think about.
I agree, and I think that Heather McDonald talking about going back to the idea of role of government, in a government controlled society, you kind of agree. They're going to tell you what's safe, what you can do. But in America, we're not supposed to be like that. We have this presumption of liberty, the presumption of rights of the individual to live your life freely. And so, that's how you're supposed to get to live unless there's a particular threat. And if there is, the order from the governor, whoever it is, has to be closely tailored to the threat, limited in a variety of ways, so that it doesn't just become expansive. We were talking in the break about what's going to happen with the next big threat, the next big virus. If we're agreeing, if we as a culture, as a society say, well, if it's a big darn threat and a very, very scary virus, fine, we'll just surrender, just tell us, keep us safe. And that really isn't the role of government to keep us safe. It's the role of federal government to fund the military and have us, protected. But the idea of keeping you safe in your day-to-day life isn't really the job of the government.
And I think we may come out when this is all done, finding out that the death rate, as terrible as it is, may be about what it would be with a severe flu outbreak. And Dr. Fauci has even suggested in the Journal of American Medical Association, it might be around like a severe flu outbreak. Does that mean if we get a severe flu outbreak next fall, or that we're going to have to do the same thing? We just don't know. And it's a heavy toll that we're paying for this. And I think it's at least possible we come back and look at this and say, we made a lot of mistakes in this. We overreacted. It might have been justified initially, but then we may come back and look at it and say, we just made a lot of mistakes.
I think your husband Eric wrote about that. We'll get to that in just a little bit.
Sure did.
Since we're talking about the future, this is a question that came up the other day, and it was created in large part by Senator Phil Gramm, former senator, and many of us remember him as not only an individual who's the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, but one of the few members of Congress that had an economics degree. He was
PhD.
a professor.
He was a professor at Texas A&M.
And remember back in the days when we had Dick Armey and we had Phil Gramm, and we said, okay, there's at least a few people in Congress that know about economics. But he did remind us that the 3 stimulus packages we have increased federal spending by half, have quadrupled the deficit, and will trigger, he believes, and I don't disagree with him, the largest monetary expansion since the Civil War, which tells me that do we want another stimulus package? Because right now, Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer and Chuck Schumer, they got another one ready to go.
They're already talking about it.
They can't wait. They just can't wait. We talked and briefly say here, we may get to it again later, but back in 2009 when President Obama was dealing with the economy being very troubled over the stock market collapse, and they essentially increased the budget by about 50%. And what people didn't grasp at the time, or maybe are more aware of now, is they started to treat that as the floor.
Baseline.
And so that's the baseline. We have to be, among the many things Americans be alert to, is this is emergency spending, and it's got to be over. I think Republicans should just say, we're just say no on further spending at this point.
I agree.
Yeah. Well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, if you take a political science class, they always talk about unintended consequences. Dr. Matthews already took us through one, and that is where the CDC said, let's just completely postpone any non-essential surgery, and then we're bankrupting individuals. But let's look at another one, and that is the decision to provide very generous unemployment benefits and some of the circumstances that came from that, as well as we already talked about the Paycheck Protection Program and some of the issues related to those. So those will be a couple of topics we'll put on the table. And if you find yourself saying, boy, I really like to read some of these articles, that's why we have those on the website, pointofview.net. First one by, again, Dr. Merrill Matthews on the healthcare system. That will take you to ipi.org, so you can certainly find that one. A little bit later, we will be getting to a couple of them, one on the left's kill shot on America, but I was saving that for, of course, when we have our listeners from Georgia, because that obviously gets into Governor Brian Kemp. And then we have a couple of others on reopening the economy and some very good pieces by, of course, our friend Debbie Georgatos about the immunity passports. We got a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
The air is leaking out of the bubble of frustration we've all been living in. There's a national sense of relief as states and localities announce their relaxing lockdowns, quarantines, and social distancing standards. We're anxious to jump back into normal life, also cautious, a bit hesitant. Now that Americans are getting a few more opportunities to try to work again, shop again, pursue recreation in public, and even have elective surgery, some of us are choosy about which of these opportunities to pursue. Political commentator Ben Shapiro wonders if we haven't gotten used to the feeling of safety we've acquired. Or worse, perhaps we as a society, he speculates, have so fundamentally altered our own perception of risk aversion that we aren't willing to leave our houses unless the risk is close to zero. Lots of governors are saying that this is the attitude Americans over 65, or those with certain underlying medical conditions, ought to have, at least until phase 3. Stay home, stay safe. But Americans are wise to remember what the lockdowns were for, to flatten the curve. We're going to see second wave spreading of the virus. Ben Shapiro points out that when we emerge from our homes, we will pass the virus to one another again. Americans are doing what Americans are supposed to do. They are assessing risks and benefits, and as the government decides less and less for them, they're deciding for themselves what is best to do and not to do. We'll get help from President Trump's 3 phases of guidelines that are based on how each region of the country does when people start to emerge into society. And more testing will help. Of the plans to open cities and communities, New York Times columnist Russ Dutat writes that each will be its own unique experiment with confounding variables of climate, density, age, and genetics that are nearly impossible to model. Lord, give us wisdom, boldness, and grace. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Weekend edition, and Debbie Georgatos and Merrill Matthews in studio with us today. Let me tell the story of a small business owner in Washington. It's Jamie Black Lewis, owns 2 spas, and was thrilled that she was able to secure some small business loans through the Paycheck Protection Program. So then she told her employees, I should say, and she said, all of a sudden, a firestorm of hatred broke out. And she's like, what? I've had to lay you off. I've had to actually furlough some of you. And she said her employees, were upset because they believed that they would get much more generous unemployment benefits than they would get paid if they actually worked their job. And then, of course, Jamie Black Lewis said, on what planet am I competing with unemployment? Let me now move from Washington State to Oregon. And here, this was actually an op-ed. You can find this in the Wall Street Journal, in which Kurt Huffman, in this particular case, had restaurants, and because of the coronavirus, had to lay off 700 people.
Bunch of people.
He had a lot of restaurants apparently up there in Portland, Oregon, which I did not know. But then he began to realize, wait a minute, we can adapt, we can do takeout, we can do delivery, so I want to hire people back. Nobody wanted to come. And it turns out that he said, well, wait a minute. It turns out that according to the CARES Act, starting wage for a line cook is about $640 a week. But the unemployment that they would get from Oregon is $416 a week. But then they get a $600 federal bonus, which means by sitting home and not working at the restaurant, you'd be making more than $1,000 a week. And as this editorial points out, it isn't necessarily because workers are lazy. They're just making rational decisions. And, Debbie, I'll come to you first. This didn't catch anybody off guard. We talked about Senator Ben Sasse, Senator Lindsey Graham, Senator Tim Scott, and Senator Rick Scott, who all tried to change the language because they recognize when you pay people more for staying home than for working, guess what happens? They make rational decisions.
They make rational decisions. And again, to my point earlier about the way the left thinks, I have one more story I want to add to yours, but the way the left thinks, if you get people who will happily be dependent on government, and they get $1,000 a month or whatever that tallied up to stay home, these people are going to be voters who say, I want to vote for the people who are going to perpetuate this, which is always going to be the left trying to, I am speaking generally, but are going to try to perpetuate more dependency. This is very much feeding into the leftist growth of dependency on government. So it is the same challenge that we faced even before this came along in coming with welfare policy, all sorts of policy that hands out money is, you always want to write it in a way that you incentivize work. You want to incentivize people to go back to work, not punish them for going back to work. Very challenging. The story I mentioned too, I thought really got to me, which was this couple who, were in Kentucky in a very low income area. They a married couple. Their business was they created a coffee shop, and the coffee shop was in an area where there wasn't another one around. It was a freestand. It was a good coffee, Wi-Fi, and a place to talk. It was the only place to go in the area, and they had good coffee. And the people coming in, Wi-Fi, and visiting each other, and it was like a center for the community. They had to close down, and then they realized that, and actually had, as this program kicked into place, they had employees asking the owners, could you please lay me off, because I've already done the math. I can earn more if you just get rid of me. This is unhealthy to this idea of a working, self-reliant, free market entrepreneurial America.
So go to New Mexico, and I know a person there who was working at a restaurant, got laid off, talked to him a couple of weeks ago, and he said, well, I've been laid off, and they're only going to give me $400 a week, and that's going to be kind of tough for me to make it. But I'll just have to survive. Then a week later, he said, I'm going to, the restaurant's actually going to start doing some more takeout and so forth, and they asked me to come back, work not as a waiter, which is what he was, but to work in the kitchen and so forth, and they'll pay me a salary, and then I'll make more than $400 a week, and so I think I'm going to take that. And then here just a few days ago, he said, well, as it turns out, I found out now I'm going to get an extra $600 a week, and that's $1,000 a week, and that's more than I've ever made. And so I'm not going to take the job. I'm going to stay home. And not only are they paying him more, but under the rules of most of the governors, you're supposed to be staying home anyway. So if I can stay home and make $1,000, and rather than going in and risking something and making less, why wouldn't I stay home?
Here we go.
So unhealthy to the whole spirit of America, the whole spirit of a self-reliant people, an economy built on people contributing their value and being paid, reward for their labor. All of that, what freedom is built on in America, is just eviscerated by this.
Back prior to Obamacare, I think if I remember right, something like 47% of the population got a check from the federal government. Now that included Social Security and some other. So it wasn't.
That number's right.
These weren't all welfare, but something like 47%. And when Obamacare came in, the people who were starting to move into the Obamacare exchanges were getting money from the federal government to buy health insurance. And I mentioned at the time, we've probably gone over the tipping point, and we're over 50% now. With this, you're going to have a significantly larger number of people who are now getting money from the federal government.
You know what that reminds me of? You're speaking of Senator Phil Gramm. One of his famous adages was, "We got too many people sitting in the cart and not enough people pulling."
That's exactly.
There
That
we
was
are.
one of his favorites.
And I was going to bring it up because, people always got upset about that when we would use that around here, because some people said, wait a minute, I paid into Social Security, Medicare. Okay, I got that. But still, you have to have enough people pulling the cart. When you have too many people in the cart, I don't even matter if you paid into it. You still have to have the younger generation pulling it.
Right.
So that is the case. And of course, a fair number are benefiting from that largesse. Since they're going to be staying at home and you say they're going to vote, the former First Lady has actually been pushing forward the idea that the entire country would vote by mail. Any problem with that?
How long do we have to address this? First of all,
She
I'll
didn't see that
recommend.
coming, but I knew I'd get her reaction on that. And I have written a commentary coming out next week on that, too.
I was just emailing this morning with someone at Heritage Foundation, Hans von Spakovsky, who writes about this regularly, about mail-in ballots fraught with fraud. I mean, you could just, it is a ticket to fraud. And so the other way that the left has tried to take advantage of this unfortunate catastrophe of the coronavirus is to try to implement much of what they tried to do previously, couldn't get through the Senate, but basically let everyone cheat in voting act. They had a real name, I don't know what it was, but the point was enabling all these, or in fact, requiring all of these processes in voting that California has in place, mandating them nationwide, which essentially allow
Ballot harvesting, did you like that?
Ballot harvesting, mail-in ballots. I mean,
Same-day
anyone.
registration. You register to vote the day of the election. You know, on and on.
Taking away all the state's power to make those kind of decisions that they're supposed to make themselves.
It's amazing, but again, they're using this to, and I think Governor Newsom from California made this point a few weeks ago. We need to use this to change the governmental system in the country.
Well,
Eric Holder, too. I'm sorry. Eric Holder, too, jumped in and said.
Eric Holder did it as well.
Yeah, this is our opportunity to change the way we vote in this country.
So it isn't just the former First Lady Michelle Obama, but it's Eric Holder and Gavin Newsom and a variety of others. And 5 states already do have vote by mail. And, of course, you do have absentee voting, but you then have a situation in which you don't know if that's the right person that actually casts that vote. You don't have an election official watching to see whether or not you're being intimidated, and on and on and on. But on the one hand, you have Joe Biden saying that he's just convinced that Donald Trump is going to postpone the November election. But on the other side, you have the conservatives saying, wait a minute, no, they want to just change this so that everybody votes by mail, or maybe vote by internet. What could possibly go wrong with that, right?
Wow.
Well, we need to take a break. And when we come back, we'll have, of course, the National Hour. And then we want to get into, of course, the fact that I think almost everybody in the country, including the president, has criticized the governor of Georgia. So maybe we'll talk about what's going on there right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is our weekend edition, and we are privileged to have around the table here Debbie Georgatos, who, of course, is a talk show host as well as a lawyer and author of a number of books. And, Debbie, it is great to have you here today.
So fun to be here. Thank you.
And Dr. Merrill Matthews with us as well with the IPI, that is, again, the Institute of Policy Innovation Resident Scholar. And, Dr. Matthews, always good to have you as well.
It's good to be anywhere these days, except my house.
Just get out of the house. Let me just mention that we have lots of articles here today. One by Dr. Merrill Matthews, Destroying the Healthcare System to Save It. We have one by Debbie Georgatos, Coronavirus Immunity Cards. Kill that idea right away. And we will get to that. And also one by Heather McDonald, Deadly Cost of Extended Shutdown Orders. But since we are certainly having a lot of listeners from places like Georgia and Florida joining us, one of the articles, actually by your husband, Eric Georgatos, Less Kill Shot on America. And it has to do with the fact that today, the orders that were somewhat restrictive have loosened dramatically in the state of Georgia. Not just there, by the way, I might just mention. But Governor Brian Kemp is in the news. And as we open up the phones in a few minutes, I suspect many of you are want to speak to that issue. What about Florida? Rich Lowry put it this way: social distancing isn't a religion. Oh, it's not? It says, forgive Jacksonville, Florida, for it has sinned, because the largest city in Florida partially reopened its beaches and became something of a national scandal. So here we are. Some people said it's past time to begin to see if we can still exercise social distancing, still wear masks, but bring us back to something that looks a little bit like normalcy. So your thoughts about this?
Well, there are a lot of topics here, and I have thoughts on all of them in your question. But on the point of this, my husband's article about using the term kill shot, he's talking about the idea, before we get to whatever the Georgia governor, the interaction between President Trump and the Georgia governor, was just the idea that the left has taken advantage of this unfortunate and horrible, coronavirus to use it in a way to gain power, to and to diminish President Trump, to harm his presidency, to make it less likely he can win election again in November. And so we got through the Trump-Russia collusion hoax, couldn't take him out there. Tried to go through the impeachment for nothing, and that fell apart. And so they've been trying to destroy him. And the premise he was originally talking about was just the idea that, this is being used by the left, and we need to be alert to that, and not just think that then take the left's arguments at face value about what policies we should keep in place to protect us from coronavirus. So that's the kill shot. But back to Georgia, it was very unfortunate, because the Georgia governor, in seeming to attempt to comply with and go along with the guidelines the president put out, saying, hey, we're going to get back to work here. And so, president put out guidelines, 3 phases. And then the Georgia governor, in apparently, I think he probably thought was following suit from what the president did, had allowance of loosening of some regulations in Georgia to permit people to, and I don't know why they had open tattoo parlors, but they opened, hairdressers, hairdressers, barbers,
essential
blah, blah.
businesses in some states.
But what the point he was making, which I think was really good, I think it was very unfortunate for all of the movement among conservatives to say, we've got to open America back up. We've got to save the economy, that the harm to people's lives from the shutdown matters too. That whole effort, which is more of a conservative effort, is being, so they would have lauded what the governor did, and then President Trump weighed in with the governor and criticized that some of what he didn't comply with what the tone of or the idea, the guidelines the president had. So he, by just one little sentence he uttered, or several sentences the president uttered, he may have actually given some ammo to the jurisdictions around the country that are far more limiting of people's freedom, far more like we have here in Dallas County and many other places, far more limiting. She's basically saying, President Trump, please don't help the people who love the shutdown. Please support the people who are trying to end it.
And Dr. Merrill Matthews, let me come up with that because, most of the governors are Republican, but that's not necessarily always the case because one of the governors in Colorado is a Democratic governor.
Right.
So.
Yeah, you get the sense that most of the governors pushing to open things up are more conservative or on the Republican side. But I think it's at least possible because Governor Kemp went against President Trump and nominating and putting Kelly Loeffler in the Senate seat. And
Yes.
President Trump was apparently quite upset about that. So it wouldn't surprise me. President Trump sometimes has a little bit of payback somewhere down the line.
Maybe that's what's going on.
And it wouldn't surprise me if there wasn't, you crossed me on this. I'm getting back against you a little bit on that. I have no idea if that's the case, but it just wouldn't surprise me.
Well, again, part of the issue has to do with how draconian, to overuse a word, or how extreme do some of these orders need to be? Because I mentioned the Rich Lowry one of, they opened up the beaches. And yet it turns out, if you look at the studies, that we can't really find that outdoor activities have turned out to be dangerous. One study examined hundreds and hundreds of these outbreaks and could only find one example of a transmission of the virus from an outdoor environment. But you can remember when there were people like Jake Tapper upset that people were running and biking and rollerblading along San Francisco's Embarcadero. And many of us are well aware that just down the road from where we're broadcasting right now, there's a trail that they wanted to close down because, after all, people are walking next to each other or past them. And you actually bike down some of those roads, don't you?
I go out and ride bicycle. My wife and I walk around some of those trails. And what you see on those, at least what I think I see, is families that may be not social distancing, but my wife and I are in the house together all day, so I don't know why we would necessarily be 6 feet apart if we're walking down a path. But you see bicycles passing by people, you see other people, and actually what happens is when you're coming up against somebody else, they tend to be sort of veering apart a little bit so that they're keeping space. I mean, I look at this and I think I wouldn't say impossible, but I would think virtually impossible for somebody who's walking 4 or 5 or 6 feet, or a bicycle that's passing me going 10 miles an hour, for a little coronavirus germ to jump off that person and me to pick it up. I just think that's really unlikely.
And again, we've talked about all sorts of examples there on the beach. You had people that were cited for watching a sunset in San Diego. Yeah. You had the paddleboarder out there off of, I think it was Malibu. Yeah. And then Tom Brady, since we've got to go to the other coast here, was kicked out of a Tampa Bay park because he was there alone. There just comes a point in time where some of this seems a little extreme. What's your thoughts?
I do think it seems extreme. And we're back to that point we were talking about a little bit earlier about how the idea, at some point, government in America includes an element of trusting the American people. This reopening of the beaches that they're talking about. I mean, I guess 2 points. One is that some people who are in law enforcement seem to be overzealous in their enforcement, overzealous in their willingness to stop people, to cite people for violations. And that is really unfortunate. Maybe they're doing it out of fear, but I think that there is more of a sense that the term police state offends a lot of people, but something more of you're being watched all the time. Are we allowed to do this? Are we allowed to go here or do this? And people don't like that very much. And I think there's an element of just trusting the people. On the beaches thing, I heard Governor Abbott yesterday, I think it was yesterday, and WBAP was saying, we're going to trust the people. We're going to have the beaches open, but we're going to socially distance. I'm thinking, I don't think so. We're not going to.
Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Ramadan begins today. It is the holy month of fasting for Muslims. But you may have noticed that Ramadan seems to be a time of increased attacks on infidels. Every year, the death toll runs into the hundreds. I fear this year the statistics will also be grim. At first, this seems like a contradiction. Ramadan occurs during the 9th lunar month in the Islamic calendar. It is a time when Muslims fast from their first prayer in the morning to their fourth prayer after sunset. They also refrain from all sorts of activities and focus their minds on fervent prayer. Ramadan is a holy month, so why all the violence? One of my regular guests on radio is Dr. Jim Dennison. He explains that Muslims believe that they will receive greater rewards during this month on the Islamic calendar. Muhammad himself actually preached a sermon on Ramadan in which he said, "Whoever performs an obligatory deed in this month shall receive the reward of performing 70 obligations at any other time." One Taliban spokesman therefore proclaimed, "Our fight is jihad and an obligatory worship, and even obligatory act of worship has 70 times more reward in Ramadan." So I guess it's not surprising that jihadists use this month to maximize their rewards. Each attack is different. A gunman stormed a casino in Manila. Attackers killed more than 24 Coptic Christians traveling on a bus in Egypt. A suicide attack in Kabul destroyed the embassy, and attackers in London drove over pedestrians and then stabbed others after leaving the vehicle. Ramadan begins today. Let us pray that it will end without the usual violence that has been part of it in the past. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you would like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Some of these orders are being loosened, and love to get your thoughts about that. And one of the things that you pointed to, Debbie, was a piece that they quoted from Britt Hume. Now, I met Britt Hume back in 1974, so that was kind of interesting. Had a chance to introduce him when he was speaking at our college. But nevertheless, he has said, he thinks it's possible that this lockdown has, in some respects, been obviously damaging to the economy, damaging to business, obviously, jobs lost. But also he goes on to talk about the effect it has on children. And it also relates to something we're going to get to a little bit later with Dr. Merrill Matthews, because we talk about some of these hospitals closing down. It isn't just the financial issues, it's the medical issues of undetected various kinds of diseases, and it's the mental issues. So there has been a heavy price to pay, both financially, medically, and in terms of mental health, right?
That's true here. It's true in other countries. I was listening to a story a couple of days ago. There are a lot of immigrants here who work and send money home to help because their home, people are so poor, there's no money. And it said Africa is going to be struggling because so much of the money that people would have made here, taxi drivers, Uber and other things, can't send that money back now. So the remittances to other countries has dropped dramatically, and now they have no money. And so it's the U.S., but it has ramifications other places.
That is just really tragic. And, in fact, I'm glad you gave that detail because I saw a headline about that story and I didn't really realize what they were saying, but that it is the unintended consequences were just not, they were truly unseen by so many people. And this is what I get around the point in one of the articles I mentioned earlier was even if at the time we made these policies, we thought, wow, we have terrible numbers coming in. This is horrible. Look what they're predicting. We're going to have 1.5 to 2.2 million Americans dead, and all these models, which were terribly off. And so we made really draconian rules. But at some point, so here we are toward the end of April, we ought to be able to re-examine everything we're doing in light of now we can see these policies. So maybe we don't have to hurt Africa as badly. Maybe we don't have to hurt the economy so badly. We've got to adjust, but it's very hard for people. There's a lot of fear in our society. It's a pandemic of fear. And it's very hard for government officials to say, we might have overreacted. But I would love to see that. I'd love to see a national signal to America. We might have overreacted to this.
And one of the pieces that is likely to come out from me next month is the tyranny of the models, because we use modeling for so many things. Remember, the modeling from the Congressional Budget Office was that Obamacare was paid for. And nobody with any sense actually believed that. Yeah. But they tweaked the model in order to make it say that it was paid for. The modeling in the climate change stuff. When reporters come on and say, you're just rejecting the science, and then they'll go and talk about the models. But the models aren't the science. The science are the temperatures that we're taking and other things of that nature. The models are assumptions, other things being put into the model to try to deduce what's going to happen 10, 50, 100, or 1,000 years from now. They may be way off in those models, and I think in many cases they are. And then so now you have the models on the spread of the pandemic. And as you point out, I mean, the British epidemiologist predicted, 3 weeks ago or so, that they would have 510,000 deaths in Great Britain and 2.2 million deaths in the United States. Yep. And I wrote a piece for The Hill about this, saying, count me as skeptical on this.
Oh, sure.
The day after he wrote that, they came out and reported that he had said, well, maybe it won't be 510,000 Great British deaths. It might be less than 20,000. 510,000 to 20,000. That's a magnitude of error that you gloss over and say, we just changed some of the assumptions and it worked out much better.
Was that is it Neil Ferguson? Is that
yes.
the doctor? Yeah. Oh my gosh.
That's a good piece.
Big
piece.
change. Yeah. Big change in what they did. And even in America, the models we had with respect to the coronavirus, we had one put out the series, in fact, that really led the Dallas County judge to put the order in place was put out by a group called COVID Act Now.
Oh, yes.
Which was if you dig in and find out who these people are, they're based in Silicon Valley. They're leftists. They are Hillary Clinton supporters. They're part of an effort to make sure Donald Trump did not get reelected. And they had numbers, even if you want to assume, which I don't, that they were in good faith, drastic numbers. If you saw those numbers and you were in charge of any county, you'd say, my gosh, everything's got to stop. We got to freeze in place. We're not going to have enough hospital beds or ICU beds. And it was just grotesquely exaggerated. And so models can have bad data in an innocent way. And they can also have actually motivated data, politically motivated data, which they do, I think, in climate change and certainly in this too.
Well, a friend of mine, a scholar, likes to point out to another modeler from years ago who said, all models are wrong, but some are helpful.
That's good.
Well, and there are some models that work, like in the insurance agencies, they try to figure out what your lifespan might be. And so those work pretty well because they are based on a lot of data over a lot of people over a short period of time. But when they start using this to tell us what the temperature is going to be in the 22nd century, we go, I don't think so, since you have trouble trying to tell me whether it's going to rain tomorrow.
And just on the data for the coronavirus, there is no standard of what is a death by coronavirus. There is no standard.
Oh, now you're getting to the first caller's question.
Which is people, not among states, not among even hospitals, not among even individual doctors. So there are doctors who are saying if somebody came in and they had passed away, but it looked like, or the family mentioned that it sounded like they had the coronavirus, we attribute it to that. If a person has influenza, say something that they're about ready to die from, emphysema could be one, and maybe they think this person doesn't have long to live, maybe a year, a month or two, and they come down with coronavirus and they die from that. It's a coronavirus, even though they were expected to die in the near future. These are terrible things to talk about, but on the other hand, we have no standard of what the death is, and then other countries, China talked about its death. They're saying those deaths are not as many. What was their definition of a coronavirus death versus what's happening in the U.S.?
Yeah, it's a difference between dying from the COVID-19 and dying with COVID-19.
Right. There you go.
And that, I might as well get to, that's one of the callers wants to bring that up. So we'll head to the state of Nevada. Allison, listening on KYCC, you have the floor.
Hi. Yeah, I actually called with that exact concern, and I think this last week when we have started to see, reports of the CDC and, reporting deaths in cases that were able to report with, no probable causes or any, symptoms relating. So my concern is I live in Nevada, and one of the extreme cases with governors who fall under what you guys were just talking about in California, along the same lines. My concern is just that if we're following that, numbers have to be declining in order to open up these different areas, when now we know for a fact that we can report basically anything as COVID, how is that ever going to happen? I think the scariest thing to me, and I don't know if you guys have been seeing this, but when you show this to just the general public, and I show it to friends, whether they're Christian or not, their eyes are not opening. They're not seeing what's going on. And that's the scarier thing to me, that they've been so duped by media for so many years that they don't see it. They're like, oh, well, and that's the really alarming thing to me. I have hope and prayer, and I know God's going to work in all of this, and we know that he has a miracle up his sleeve. And, so that's our hope. It continues through all this. But that's what I was calling in on. Just relating to all that.
We'll get to some more phone calls, but Debbie, any thoughts about that?
I love your point, Allison, about the CDC. And in particular, there was a doctor who did a lengthy video just saying, I feel I'm not able to do my honest practice of medicine in recording cause of death because CDC is encouraging me to say if I'm guessing, or maybe it contributes to count it as a COVID-19 or coronavirus death. And it begins to make you wonder about if that is why, and I'm unaware of any other disease in which this kind of thing has occurred. It feels like an agenda to exaggerate, to perpetuate fear, which means there need to be more voices, national voices in Washington and around states starting to help. Allison, the people you are talking about said they can't seem to penetrate. You can't penetrate. They can't absorb data. They need to have help from the news media, from other sources telling them there's a different way to look at this. We know more now than we used to, because you've got to allay their fear to ever get around to opening up safely.
One of the things we've said is it's been hard to figure out what the real fatality rate is or the death rate is, because we said we know what the numerator is, the number of people who died, but we didn't know what the denominator is. Now we're saying we're not even sure we know what the numerator is, because just the other day, New York City added 3,700 deaths to the total, just assuming that those people died of COVID. And so as a result, even the numerator is a question mark, but the denominator always has, because we haven't done enough antibody testing to find out how many people might have actually contracted the virus but are asymptomatic. So, Allison, thank you for that. And, of course, Dr. Merrill Matthews took us down that road. When we come back, though, I want to talk about when we open up some areas, the difference between opening up New York City and Montana might be a little different. We'll talk about that right after this.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Debbie Georgatos and Dr. Merrill Matthews here. And one of the articles we've posted is by Heather McDonald, but I'll pick out two because there was a good piece that came out just by Rich Lowry in which he was saying, you can't use each state as the example because in New York City, for example, you got more than 10,000 deaths, and he's got, I think, low numbers there. That's very different than opening up Montana, which had 14, okay? Or let's use an example that Debbie Georgatos, you can help us with because you actually grew up in New York, and you're familiar with this. The day after Andrew Cuomo actually called for a moratorium, and obviously that is for the entire state, the individuals that were in some of these smaller counties, for example, Jefferson County, Lewis County, Oswego County, St. Lawrence County, they have lots of people, but they had just a handful of hospitalizations, only one death, and they were saying, why should upstate counties be subject to the same restrictions as New York City? So whether you're doing a state-by-state comparison or even within a state, I think a lot of it has to depend on whether you're in the midst of a hot spot or whether you're in some of these counties that have never had anybody tested for coronavirus.
Completely agree, and I'm glad those people spoke up from those more rural or remote counties. And, actually talk about the economic damage that the shutdown is doing to our country. You could do a lot to fix it by being more focused in the policies you make. We've got to, New York City apparently is just going to have to be shut down for a while until they get this under control. But throughout New York State, there are many rural areas in upstate New York and throughout our country that actually not only could be working and not restricted, but they could be helping the economy come back because everyone in New York and in Texas too, pretty much. In fact, I read a statistic: 93% of America is of population of America is under some shutdown order. So nothing's happening. The people who have more desk jobs, more professional jobs, maybe are working at home some, but people are hurt by this in a lower echelon of income, especially. And these orders they're designed to protect, but at some point they really, especially in areas where they aren't needed, they're especially hurting the economy.
In states like Montana and here in West Texas, social distancing is a way of life.
Wyoming, yeah. You can't even see your neighbor.
You talk about old
places.
Joe; he's 5 miles down the road.
So they're already practicing.
Don't hit the cows as you try to get there.
Let's take some phone calls along the way. We'll do our best to get some calls in here, but we certainly have a lot to cover with all these very good articles we've posted. But let's head out to Georgia on the Good News Network. Luke, what would you like to ask around the table here?
Yeah, I would just like to see someone. First of all, thanks for having me.
Thank you.
I would like to see someone make a comparison of numbers. It seems like it would be fairly simple math if we could look at the death rate, the average death rate prior to the pandemic, take the totals, including the cases attributed to COVID, and then just do a little bit of basic math with some subtraction and kind of see where we landed and how many. My suspicions would be that the typical non-COVID death rate would come out much lower during this time of the pandemic, indicating that there's evidence of mass manipulation of the numbers.
I couldn't. I'm going to let go. Let me pass to Buddy.
As what I understand him suggesting is that if we were to go back and look at the typical death rates for New York for, say, last year,
right,
and the year before, you'd probably see certain types of spikes during the winter because of flu, pneumonia, and other things, and then compare this year to those times. My guess is it will be somewhat higher, but I don't know that it'll be a lot higher. And I wrote a little while back that I suspect cases of flu and other contagious diseases are probably going to be down significantly this year, I would think, because you've got, for the same reason that people aren't around each other. So if we were to come back after this and we were able to sort of compare these data, my guess is this year is going to be higher, but it may not be as high as the amount of deaths that they're suggesting are from COVID-19.
I saw one point too someone was making about how in a particular geographic area, I'm not sure where it was, but I don't have the article in front of me, but they're making the point that for the relative period comparing this year to last year, it was surprisingly low reporting of cases of death from pneumonia. Mm-hmm. But that's because those cases were being reported as death from COVID-19. They're labeling them
just
that because
moving them around a little bit. Let me just mention real quickly, I meant to do this at the bottom of the hour, but we'll be doing this all through the program. Some of you might say, I'm in a state right now, and I'd like to contact my governor, because in some respects, it's the governors that are making that decision. So if you go to our website, I've been mentioning we're going to make this available, and it's available today, and we'll talk about it next week. Go to the website, pointofview.net. On the Take Action item, it's entitled Reopening the Economy. And what it does is it reminds you that in some respects, the guidelines that we talked about a week ago really give a lot of opportunity for governors to make decisions. And so, for example, we've already heard from people from Nevada and Georgia. We're going to hear from North Carolina in just a minute. And if you would like to contact your governor, we aren't actually writing a letter for you. We're letting you write the letter, but it's something that we wanted to give each one of you an opportunity to do. Now, as you go there, you're going to see a chart because it points out that a number of the states are working together. You have the multi-state council that has been put together through New York and Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts. I think I picked them all there, maybe Delaware. Then you have a kind of another Midwestern state partnership. And then we also have, of course, the Western State Pact, which is California, Oregon, and Washington. But if you would like to contact your governor, say, I appreciate what you're doing and I appreciate the decision you've just made, or I'm concerned about that, we've made it very easy for you to contact your governors because all you have to do is put your name, address there, and it will then pull up the email address for your governor so that you can express your opinion. And I think it's back to the point I was making a minute ago, Debbie. That is very different in upstate New York than it is in New York City. It's very different in New York than it is in Montana. It's very different in Northern California than it is in Southern California. So you just have to recognize that each one of those particular states and even the regions in the state are going to have to be a case-by-case basis, aren't they?
They sure are, Kerby. I love that you did that at pointofview.net. You have access to the governors because they really are the people. Even in the state of Texas, we've been talking about where we are in Dallas County, that we have a county judge, and that a similar position exists in counties around the country. Really, the governor has the primary authority, meaning if the governor says X is going to happen, he or she can tell the county judges, the county authorities, the city authorities, that your order isn't any longer appropriate because this is what we're doing. So the governors have the right to do that. The other thing I will say, I think is a helpful and positive thing about contacting your governor is all the information that governors and the president received when we first became aware of this. It was all on the side of, look at how dangerous we think this virus is going to be. Look at the numbers. And so if you are a public official and you care, obviously you care about the people, you're going to do the most protective thing that you can think of. Only as we've worked along through this time, we started to see, as you were calling it, the unintended consequences, the harm to the economy, the harm to individual health because people are forced to stay home. Those kind of stories and those sentiments have to be heard by the governors that I live in your state and I really want to go back to work. My business is X. We can't socially distance and we can do whatever else we're supposed to be doing. But I think the pressure helps the governors not just feel better about relaxing the rules they have, but also really think that they are serving the needs of the people because they're hearing from them.
And kudos to Governor Greg Abbott because he, when he initially started coming out with these, he did not impose his restrictions statewide. He got a lot of criticism for that, and he said at the time, over half our counties don't have no COVID-19 cases, so there's no point in us doing that there until we see some outbreaks there. And so he did some of that sort of adjusting it for the region and so forth within the state.
And I love that because in Texas at that time, I think half the counties did not have one positive case of COVID-19. interesting enough, at that same time when he said that, that's changed a little bit. Almost a third of the counties in the country did not have one.
Right.
And for people that live in Chicago and are listening right now, or New York City or San Francisco or wherever you might be, or Houston or Dallas, you might go, that's hard to believe. If you drive across the country, as many of us over the years have done, there are some times when you can drive for a long, long period of time and not even see another car, much less another person, right? And so that's why some of those counties have zero on
I
them.
remember listening to a radio station talking about the problem of overpopulation one time, and I said, I've been on the road for 45 minutes, and I haven't seen another car.
Even in upstate New York, there's some places in the winter where I've been where I think they have more moose in town than they have people in town, right?
For sure, small towns, upstate New York, you can go between relatively small towns, nothing out there but woods and farms, and not a lot of life.
Yeah,
not a lot of people.
And a lot of cattle out there in West Texas, but not a lot of people either. We're going to take a break. We got some more phone calls here. Some of you want to ask about restrictions on the church. Some of you want to ask about the press conference yesterday. Well, that one didn't turn out so well for Donald Trump. We will cover all of that right after this.
The air is leaking out of the bubble of frustration we've all been living in. There's a national sense of relief as states and localities announce their relaxing lockdowns, quarantines, and social distancing standards. We're anxious to jump back into normal life, also cautious, a bit hesitant. Now that Americans are getting a few more opportunities to try to work again, shop again, pursue recreation in public, and even have elective surgery, some of us are choosy about which of these opportunities to pursue. Political commentator Ben Shapiro wonders if we haven't gotten used to the feeling of safety we've acquired. Or worse, perhaps we as a society, he speculates, have so fundamentally altered our own perception of risk aversion that we aren't willing to leave our houses unless the risk is close to zero. Lots of governors are saying that this is the attitude Americans over 65 or those with certain underlying medical conditions ought to have, at least until phase 3. Stay home, stay safe. But Americans are wise to remember what the lockdowns were for, to flatten the curve. We're going to see second wave spreading of the virus. Ben Shapiro points out that when we emerge from our homes, we will pass the virus to one another again. Americans are doing what Americans are supposed to do. They are assessing risks and benefits, and as the government decides less and less for them, they're deciding for themselves what is best to do and not to do. We'll get help from President Trump's 3 phases of guidelines that are based on how each region of the country does when people start to emerge into society. And more testing will help. Of the plans to open cities and communities, New York Times columnist Russ Dutat writes that each will be its own unique experiment with confounding variables of climate, density, age, and genetics that are nearly impossible to model. Lord, give us wisdom, boldness, and grace. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we are in studio today with Debbie Georgatos and Merrill Matthews. We're going to be looking at some of their articles in just a minute because there are some great material that I wanted you to be able to read, and it's on our website. But let's head to North Carolina because I think, Brenda, you have a very good question for us today.
Yeah, absolutely, Kerby. Thank you for taking my call. I'm an avid listener every day. I love it. And, Kerby, I'm real concerned about the reopening of the state. And I know our governor, Governor Roy Cooper, he is our governor. But I'm concerned about those that are, let's say, less than 100 church members. And I'm not hearing anything about the reopening of the churches regarding those that have less than 100, because we have less than 100 at our church. And the Lord does tell us to assemble, not forsaken, assemble ourselves together. And I'm about unity and all of that, but I don't know. I'm not hearing anything about the reopening of the churches. I'm hearing about the beaches and all the tattoo parlors and all this. But what national, on a national level, what say you or you guys about the reopening of? And I'm in a very rural area, and you talked about the mooses and all that in Texas and everything, and we're very rural here. But some churches do have over 100 people. Now, my church has less than 100. We've been doing the in the car worship services,
the drive-in.
and things of that nature.
Yeah, let me just talk about that, because a good example is the state of Texas right now, because Kelly Shackelford, usually sitting there, and as a matter of fact, I'm going to be meeting with him later on another event, has tried to provide an opportunity for those where they're using basic common sense and CDC guidelines. And I'll use Texas as a good example, because Governor Abbott did say that he was no longer going to prohibit in-person meeting. But the implication of that is that if you only have maybe 50 in a chapel and you're spaced out, what's the difference there than being in a Walmart? North Carolina, as I understand, might be a little different. And since we broadcast to 42 different states, I can't tell you all the variations, which is one of the reasons why you might even want to use the take action item, because in communicating that to your governor, you could even ask a question that then would maybe get a response on, well, what would that mean for my rural church in North Carolina? So we've already made it easy for you to contact your governor, but we're starting to see some of the governors, some of them, not a lot of them, some of them start saying, I'm no longer going to prohibit in-person church services, but you need to be really careful, right?
Yes, I'm glad. I don't know actually either the particular situation in North Carolina, but I think that what Kerby's saying is a great idea. If you go to pointofview.net and you can send a note into your governor, use that means to say, I'd like to know the status of religious worship services. I think this is one area where I'd really like to see public pressure on officials at state level, just to say, we can look out for ourselves and we will follow social distancing, or we'll do the drive-in church thing. But you don't want to even start down the path in America of thinking of government feeling like they have a power to shut down church services, especially if you're willing to honor the social distancing and other requirements.
And with the social distancing, I've heard them say, if we open up, there's going to be social distancing. And I'm guessing that means, if you're sitting here, you've got somebody who's going to be, I don't know if it'd be 6 feet, but it might be 4 feet or 5 feet away, though I don't know how that works for husbands and wives who are coming from the same house. I don't know why they would necessarily need to be distanced from each other. But I would think if you're doing that, and for Brenda's church, it sounds like they might be, if they have a sanctuary large enough to allow that, I would think they should be able to go back there, even if they're wearing masks. I mean, that sort of pleases the politicians right now, and let them attend church.
And I'm going to be watching this Sunday, and we'll see if we can cover some of that next week to see if some of that has changed. We saw these orders that were saying you can't even have a drive-in church. Yeah. And so Kelly Shackelford, who was thinking that he would have a nice 3-day weekend with Good Friday, he was busier during that weekend than ever because of the case out of Louisville, Kentucky, and the one out of Mississippi. And of course, he was on Fox News and covered some of that, and eventually got some of them to back off. Because you can recognize right now that if you've had some of these mayors that have said we can't even have a drive-in church with the people in their cars with the windows rolled up, you can imagine how they're going to react to the idea of a in-person kind of church service.
And let's say something positive about this. A number of churches are doing daily messages. I know Denton Bible Church is doing that. Yes. The quarantine, they call it the Quarantine Bible Church, and they do daily messages in there. And there are people who are sitting at home with not much else to do, and you may have a spreading of the gospel going on here in a way that you might not have had otherwise, just because of this. So sometimes, the saying is, the Lord sometimes hits a straight lick with a crooked stick, and that may be happening here.
We talked about that with Pastor Jack Graham on Wednesday, and Greg Laurie's talked about that. They are all saying that more people are watching their services than you could pack into those actual sanctuaries. I'll use Prestonwood since he was on Wednesday. When you have 1 million people watching and you have a sanctuary that holds 7,000, you can do the math, figure out there's no way that this hasn't been a vast expansion of first for Greg Laurie, Robert Jeffress, and then Jack Graham, partially because in each one of those cases, President Donald Trump says, I'm going to be watching First Baptist or Harvest or Prestonwood. And so every time he announces which one he's going to watch, a lot of people go, okay, I'm going to see what the president's going to watch this Sunday. And it's been a great opportunity.
Okay, so I'll make a prediction here. If we see another Great Awakening revival coming, the left will shut this thing down and get us back.
They'll shut down the shutdown. Yeah.
They'll shut down the shutdown.
Yeah, for sure. Let's real quickly, before we take a break, I think Brian wanted to talk about the press conference yesterday, and I think it's about time to speak to that issue. So, Brian, in South Carolina, thank you for joining us today.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you for taking my call. Yes, my question is in reference to President's comments in reference to using household bleach as an ingestant along with UV rays and heat, as well as how do you correlate that, and your panelists, what are their thoughts on how you correlate that to scientific data, as well as trying to follow Scripture when Scripture says obey those who have rule over you.
Well, and sometimes those people in positions of authority don't know what they're talking about. And we certainly have illustrated a little of that today.
Sometimes?
Yeah, okay, I'm being generous. Most of the time, our elders and our superiors don't necessarily know the medical and scientific evidence. To be fair, the president was trying to just simply get Dr. Deborah Birx up there to talk about ultraviolet radiation, which seemed to be somewhat helpful, but he would be a lot better if he just said, Dr. Deborah Birx, tell us about this study they've done on UV, instead of what was a very convoluted set of statements, which everybody's been able to make fun of today, right?
Yeah, I actually was blessed or cursed with the fact I didn't hear the press conference, and so I only read little headlines about it afterwards. But I do think that President Trump, he's trying to be helpful. He's trying to be a little bit encouraging, and he tends to not always stick with the talking points he was given, or stick with it.
What a disaster.
Just gets going.
What a disaster.
And then, of course, the media, as we contorts and exaggerates every misstatement he makes, every mistake. They go after him, trying to make him sound crazy. So I think that we don't have to consider every word that President Trump utters at a press conference as a directive from our elders. I mean, sometimes it's just a
Well, as I heard the president, he was trying to get them. He said, "You're looking into this. Is that right? You're looking." And as a person who's been on a medical school's ethics committee that approves the human research, there's oftentimes things we say we know this works, but we don't know how to do it medically. And so they would do a research protocol to say, how do we replicate this medically that we know works over here in another fashion? And so they do those research protocols, and that's sort of the sense that I got from what he was doing.
Yeah. Well, again, even Drudge Report says don't drink the bleach, so which is the case. But again, it would have just been better if he just hadn't said anything about it. But when we come back from the break, I want to spend some time getting into some of the articles that you have written. Dr. Merrill Matthews, Destroying the Healthcare System to Save It. That is one that is really of concern since you worked in that area of healthcare and what's happened in hospitals. Debbie Georgatos, I knew you were going to want to talk about the coronavirus immunity cards and a variety of other issues. So we've got a lot more to cover. And if you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. Opening up parts of the country, we'll see what that is, and we'll talk about that more right after this.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Final hour here. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me just mention that if you'd like to contact your governor, we have made it very easy. It is the take action item in the middle of pointofview.net, reopening the economy, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. But we've posted a lot of articles, and I thought for just a minute I'm going to work through some of the articles by the people sitting around this table. And Dr. Merrill Matthews, first of all, we have this one, Destroying the Healthcare System to Save It. And that would be puzzling, I think, to some people, because you said, wait a minute, how can hospitals theoretically be overwhelmed? And then at the same time, we have, as you give all sorts of examples here, of hospitals, clinics, and others forced to lay off healthcare providers.
Our listeners could be excused for thinking that the healthcare system is being overwhelmed right now, because most of the media talk about we need more doctors and nurses. These people are overwhelmed with all the work and so forth. But it turns out that, and that's true in certain areas. It certainly seems to be true in New York, maybe Chicago, Detroit, Louisiana, New Orleans. But the vast majority of hospitals, we've got more than 6,000 hospitals in the country, and they are laying people off. They're shutting down because the governors have essentially said no elective surgeries, many things that you could normally do, you're not being able to do. And the hospitals, a lot of the hospitals are sitting around with people with nothing to do because they simply can't do it. That's put a burden upon those people who've been laid off or furloughed for a while. And it's also put a burden upon the finances of the hospitals. Part of the money coming out of these relief packages are going to hospitals because they can't do care, and yet you get the system that you get the sense that we're overwhelmed. Here in Dallas, the county judge set up the convention center. I can't remember if it was 250 or 500 beds, and they had the National Guard coming in, setting up all these beds for all the overwhelmed people. And the governor finally said, "You need to take this down," because they never filled up all the hospital beds in the city.
Yeah.
Even in New York City, where they do have, of course, a horrific problem, but they have the reports about that Navy ship that went up there. There was one in the New York Harbor and one in Los Angeles, and both of them were, of all the beds that were available, a tiny portion were actually being used. I mean, New York does have a uniquely bad problem, but the rushing Navy ships up there turned out to be, I mean, it's a beautiful thing that we cared, we wanted to help, but it did not turn out to be necessary.
And I think I heard after the governor was complaining that they weren't getting enough ventilators, I saw an article, I haven't confirmed it, that they were saying we'll let some of the other states take some of our ventilators because we're not using them all.
Yeah, and I think he said that on the Sean Hannity show the other day, so that is the case. So first of all, there's the financial issue. Hospitals maybe even declaring bankruptcy. Hemorrhaging cash, doctors, hospital workers just waiting for the opportunity to begin to do elective surgery. So that certainly implies that if you have a knee replacement, and you can relate to this, or if you have all sorts of other kinds of diagnostic tests, those get postponed. So first of all, it's the financial issue. But second of all, it's the medical issue, because by not doing colonoscopies, not doing mammograms, you might have caught cancers earlier than you are right now. So there's not just the financial cost, there's the medical cost, isn't there?
Exactly right. You have the people who are not being able to get the cancer treatment that they would normally be getting. They may get some, but not all of it. And then, of course, so you have the physical aspect, and then there's the mental health aspect, where here in Dallas, one of the mental health institutions is reporting a 300% increase in calls to their hotline because of people who have mental health issues and can't get to see the doctor. Now, some of this may be able to be one of the changes we're likely to see in the healthcare system is the expansion of telemedicine. Telemedicine's been around for a while. That's where a patient is seeing a doctor through the internet, over their computer or something. There's been pushback against that historically because insurance companies weren't necessarily sure they wanted to pay for that, and state medical societies said, well, we'll let you see somebody telemedicine if you see a doctor who's in the state that you live, but we don't want you seeing a doctor outside of your state because we're a guild and we don't like you doing that kind of thing.
We don't like the other guys.
Here we go.
So that has been a restriction, but that has opened up significantly, and we may see a huge uptake in telemedicine I think we're already seeing that, but we may see more of that in the future, and that's probably a good use of technology. But my goodness, you're just seeing a lot of changes in the healthcare system with people suffering from a number of things they might not otherwise have to do.
Let me pick up on that mental health one for just a minute, because the National Bureau of Economic Research says that for every 1% increase in unemployment, and we're almost at 20%, we can see up to 3.6% increase in overdose deaths and 1% increase in suicide. Now, again, that is one of the reasons why this week and next couple of weeks, we're going to talk about the mental health issues associated with this. But you're talking about, just in this particular case, the Texas chapter of the National Alliance on Mental Health has reported a 300% increase in the helpline calls already. So you can see there is a consequence, a mental health consequence to this.
And we had a caller here earlier asking about the comparison of the death rates, and I have no idea what that's going to look like, but it would be tragic yet interesting in looking back in several months if we look back and see the suicide rate had increased significantly, and how many that might offset. I mean, if you had the suicide rate in Texas increase above its normal rate and was more than what the COVID-19 deaths would be, then you have to ask the question, are we destroying the healthcare system in order to save it?
Yes.
There's a quick parallel to make, too, between, we were talking earlier about trusting the people and instead of having government so closely regulate the conduct and how close you can be walking next to somebody and all the things that they're regulating right now. But in the medical industry, I just think there is an aspect to be rewarded about the idea of trusting doctors to, if you're a doctor and you don't have any COVID-19 patients and your hospital has a whole floor empty and your patient X needs this treatment or this test, instead of having elected officials decide what you can do, there ought to be more trust in the medical community to make good decisions about, this guy's test really can't wait, this person's treatment can't wait, this person could wait. But it's just a one-size-fits-all edict from the top that really has hurt Americans across the board.
Well, again, you will find that article on the healthcare system. It's the first article, and it's by Dr. Merrill Matthews. And also, I might encourage you, as you follow that, you can take that to ipi.org, so you can find any of his commentaries as well as many others as well. But I thought when we come back from the break, let's talk about surveillance for just a minute. This is some of the booklet I had. And earlier this week, we had Dr. Michael Gillen on. He used to be the ABC Science reporter, and his book has a whole chapter there on surveillance. But I said to him, when you wrote that book, and even when I wrote this booklet, we had no idea that surveillance was going to expand dramatically. After 9/11, we have the Patriot Act, we have the FISA courts, we have all the rest. But I suspect that this is going to get even more significant when we now have drones not only flying over China, but in Italy and places like that. We have individuals using surveillance cameras to make sure that people are staying close to home. They're actually supposed to put apps on their phone. And Dr. Debbie Georgatos has written a piece on the coronavirus immunity cards. Kill the idea right now. So when we come back, we'll talk about what about this idea of having immunity cards? So when you get stopped by law enforcement, your papers, please. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Ramadan begins today. It is the holy month of fasting for Muslims. But you may have noticed that Ramadan seems to be a time of increased attacks on infidels. Every year, the death toll runs into the hundreds. I fear this year the statistics will also be grim. At first, this seems like a contradiction. Ramadan occurs during the 9th lunar month in the Islamic calendar. It is a time when Muslims fast from their first prayer in the morning to their fourth prayer after sunset. They also refrain from all sorts of activities and focus their minds on fervent prayer. Ramadan is a holy month, so why all the violence? One of my regular guests on radio is Dr. Jim Dennison. He explains that Muslims believe that they will receive greater rewards during this month on the Islamic calendar. Muhammad himself actually preached a sermon on Ramadan in which he said, "Whoever performs an obligatory deed in this month shall receive the reward of performing 70 obligations at any other time." One Taliban spokesman therefore proclaimed, "Our fight is jihad and an obligatory worship, and even obligatory act of worship has 70 times more reward in Ramadan." So I guess it's not surprising that jihadists use this month to maximize their rewards. Each attack is different. A gunman stormed a casino in Manila. Attackers killed more than 24 Coptic Christians traveling on a bus in Egypt. A suicide attack in Kabul destroyed the embassy, and attackers in London drove over pedestrians and then stabbed others after leaving the vehicle. Ramadan begins today. Let us pray that it will end without the usual violence that has been part of it in the past. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll get to a phone call or two in just a minute, but one of the other articles we posted here, the coronavirus immunity cards kill the idea right now. Debbie Georgatos wrote this in The American Thinker. I wasn't surprised that you were against it, but it has been interesting the few times, even this week, that I've even mentioned in passing, the phones light up because people go, I don't want to go down that road. So tell us more why you are obviously concerned about this idea of an immunity passport that has actually been floated by more than just a few people.
It actually has. And right now I mentioned in the article, the country of Chile and the country of China. I didn't also mention Russia has this in place right now because they're trying to deal with the outbreak of the coronavirus. They're saying, look, you either have to have, and you can get immunity, allegedly, if you have come into contact with a virus, so you test positive, and once you are free of the virus, then you're free to roam around. So in these countries, the basic idea is it's an app on your phone. They had a story of a guy describing what happens in China. It's an app on your phone. You want to go in this restaurant, and you have a label given you by the government. You get red, yellow, or green light based on your immunity status. Have you been through coronavirus or not? And if you have been through it and you're viewed as immune, you're allowed to go out. And so the concept is, because this is such a dangerous virus and because we don't know what else to do, we don't have a vaccine yet, we're going to make sure that you have, we believe, as far as we can tell, you have immunity and you don't have the virus. If we test you now, you don't have the virus. So they have this going, and as I mentioned, the country of Chile, China, Russia, And so the characters in our country who are involved with shaping and forming our policy, we've been mentioning Dr. Fauci, obviously numerous times, the head of the National Institute of Health. He is and he's a top medical advisor to President Trump on this entire virus thing. He actually said that we are in our country in discussion about immunity cards for Americans. And so he said that that's what they're in discussions about. And then Bill Gates, heavily involved, obviously, in international efforts to spread vaccinations as a solution. And in many countries, they could be helped by more vaccinations. But Gates has said eventually we will have some digital certificates to show who has recovered or been tested recently, or when we have a vaccine, who has received it. And so the concept, this is how Bill Gates, and I'm grateful for a lot of things Bill Gates does. He brings water to communities that don't have, he does many wonderful things. But he has a mindset that says the way we're going to help out here and we're going to protect people is we're going to make sure we understand who is immune and who is not, who's had a shot once the vaccines come and who has not. And that will dictate your freedom. And so as it does in China right now and Chile. And so this is certainly what I wrote is looking into the future, but it's trying to draw a line right now with the idea that alarmed as we are about this virus, unpleasant, extremely unpleasant as we understand the suffering from this to be. People in hospitals are having a terrible time, and doctors are describing how horrific it is to go through this. And it's a very serious thing, but right now we're agreeing already to stay in our homes because we're being protected from the virus. So this is a logical extension of, okay, well, once we have a vaccine and we know who's protected, then, you got to show you have the vaccine, because otherwise, if you don't, you might be out doing exactly what we're trying to keep you from doing by forcing you to be home. And so I wrote the piece to make the argument that we should be very, very firm and saying we're not going to resort to that in our country, that we have liberty, individual liberty, as a presumption in our country. We have the presumed idea that you have rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and they don't take that away from you unless you commit a crime and get convicted. So if you have this immunity certificate that says you can't really get out of your house until you can show us you're immune or show us you've had the vaccine, you're flipping that presumption of liberty on its head. They'll tell you when you can get out and be free. And I know that some listeners may be thinking this is a little bit extreme. This probably isn't going to happen tomorrow. But I think the combination of Dr. Fauci having views as he does and has expressed and acknowledged he's talking about having immunity certificates. I don't know what they would be doing with those immunity certificates if they weren't in some way going to be planning to have those to limit your freedom. So that's why I wrote it.
I was reading a piece by an epidemiologist here a few weeks ago who said basically, and this made sense to me, said all epidemics fall apart once 80% of the public has immunity, whether it's through a vaccine, through herd immunity, or whatever else. He said because by that time, so many people have immunities that it's just not being spread. If that's the case, then you got 20% who don't need to have immunity because they're essentially, so many people do have it. I was just looking at the CDC's, the Center for Disease Control's estimates of the uptake of the flu shots, and they do about an 8-year average over there. About 62% on average of the public get a flu shot. Not everybody gets flu. But roughly 62% get a flu shot. A little higher for younger people because oftentimes you have to have that to get into schools and other things of that nature. But you do not have to have universal immunity in order to be able to have a society go where there's almost no uptake of it, which is why you wouldn't have to have an ID card to show that you've done it.
Yeah.
I love that point. And I'll say in response to that, I think that the course we chose in America, recommended by Dr. Fauci and doctors Fauci and Birx and others, was to have everyone freeze in place at home and stay in place. And so we, this discussion I think you've had in the show before, but, there have been people arguing like Dr. Katz from Yale saying we should have done vertical interdiction. We should have just protected the vulnerable and let everybody else be free and live your life normally. But instead we chose horizontal interdiction, which was everybody has to stay in place. And the outcome of that is that people staying home and not being exposed are not part of the population growing toward herd immunity. You're not part of the population to become exposed to it and dealt with it. You're still vulnerable. And so we're, because of the process we chose, perpetuating the future vulnerability of the virus to attack people or for people to become ill because people aren't becoming immune.
Yes. Well, again, there's a constitutional issue that you point out here, but there's also kind of the medical one, because right now they're not so sure that even if people have the antibodies, that they've had a strong enough response that gives them immunity. And even if they have immunity, they're now starting to say that maybe the coronavirus antibodies don't have durability, what they call durability. In other words, you might get the virus this year. You might even get sick this year, but by next year you could get it again, because we've seen in, for example, Singapore and South Korea that it doesn't necessarily suggest that once you get it, you'll never get it again, because some people have got it or received it again. And then third, some people just are starting to question whether we will ever have a vaccine for it.
And if you get a vaccine, how effective is it going to be? I mean, vaccines sometimes seem to be very effective and sometimes don't. A quick number out to the other aspect of all this is that we've built up coronavirus as this big, scary, and only threat. But National Institute of Health reported in 2012 that there are 219 virus species known to be able to infect humans, plus they discover 3 to 4 new species every year. That was 2012. And then the American Society for Microbiology reports that there are a minimum of 320,000 mammalian viruses capable of invading mammals, awaiting discovery within just 9 viral families. The point is, there will always be new viruses. I don't want there to be. I wish they would just all go away from planet Earth. But what are we going to do every time we have a new virus? Are we going to go to this extreme?
And to Debbie's point about the vaccine, we have flu vaccine. They come out with that every year. Sometimes it's pretty effective. Sometimes it's not as effective. But what you anticipate is that even if you get the flu vaccine and it's not, they didn't get the vaccine exactly right, that it still mitigates the symptoms that you have to some extent. It doesn't hit you as hard, most people, as it would otherwise, which in my opinion is as good as you're probably going to get with coronavirus. And I think that's fine. I mean, we already know the vulnerable population tends to be older people and some with comorbidities. You sort of isolate them, but you give, if you have a vaccine and people want to take that, fine. But you mitigate the damage even for people who get it who are younger, because some younger people get this and it's very, very devastating for them. But you try to mitigate that and then you move on as a society.
Well, we need to take a break. When we come back, we'll take some more phone calls. But if nothing else, wanted you to be aware of some of these articles, one having to do with the healthcare system, the cost of extended shutdowns. Also, maybe when we come back, because this relates to maybe one of the calls here, the left's kill shot on America, because that piece by your husband also mentions people like Cloward Priven, and maybe we haven't visited that for some time, and a variety of others that have really wanted to see if they could really sort of take over this country and use something like a crisis. After all, you don't want to let a serious crisis go to waste, and so what that might mean there as well. Also posted a couple of other issues which we may or may not get to. One by Victor Davis Hanson, who's been on the program with us before, America's security concerns. If you think this is of concern, there's some other things we need to pay attention to. We'll probably talk about that next week, especially when we have Gordon Chang with us and a few others. And then the attack on homeschooling, which we will also cover next week, because Harvard Magazine and even Harvard Conference says you should not homeschool your kids. We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Debbie Georgatos, Merrill Matthews. And let's take a phone call here before we get into one of the other articles. I think it's our third article on our website here on the left's kill shot on America. But Lynn in California, listening on KYCC, I think you wanted to talk about hydroxychloroquine, so go ahead.
Yes. You know, it's just sort of like it's disappeared. And I was talking with a friend of mine out here in the Bay Area, and I And I did get from her that, she basically listens to MSNBC and CNN type thing. And I had mentioned, they've had such good results with the hydroxychloroquine, when I had listened on the news on other channels, using it with the erythromycin and the zinc. And her response was, oh, no, that's very dangerous. You can't use it. And that's when, she came out that, what she listened to. And so then I went to look and research to see if you could find the benefit. It was like expunged from the internet. I finally found an article on SafeCalifornia.com that talked about a doctor in New York and then one in California that had used the combination. But other than that, you could find articles where it didn't work, but to find positive information. And it was just like, then last night I was listening to the news on just regular programming, and a man was being released from the hospital who had an elderly man, and he was doing well. And they just said, he'd been treated with an antiviral with zinc and with vitamin C and and a antibiotic type, but they never, and I don't know if it was hydroxychloroquine, but they never mentioned the name. And then just yesterday too, I was again listening and heard I think she's a senator or a congresswoman, Democrat, that had been treated, and she went to give thanks for President Trump mentioning that, because otherwise it had been stifled.
Yes.
And she's now being censored.
Let me jump real quickly to Dr. Merrill Matthews, because I'm looking at his article here, The Media's Obsession with Hydroxychloroquine and Donald Trump. And if people want to go to ipi.org, I think we posted this a couple of weeks ago, but it's the April 7th issue. And you've been writing about it, Dr. Matthews, so help Lynn out on this whole thing.
And you're absolutely right. The media, every time they do a story on this, they talk about Trump proposing an unproven drug. And when the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, assesses these drugs, they do for safety and efficacy.
Right.
So safety is the first part, efficacy is the second. And hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine have been around for 50 years or so.
Oh, yeah.
And
for malaria.
They've been approved for safety and efficacy for malaria and lupus. I think a few other autoimmune things that they use it for. They've been around for a long time. And so it's the safety is not an issue. And there is right now a phase 3 trial that's being conducted. A phase 3 trial is when you typically do a randomized double blind. That means neither the doctor nor the patient knows what they're getting. Placebo controlled. There's some kind of placebo in there. Test on that, and they're using different doses to see if they're having some effect and see what effect that might be. So that's exactly what you want. The phase 3 trial is the primary final trial, which says we find this to be effective at least in these areas. So that's going on. We should know something about that fairly quickly. But as you point out, there's been a lot of anecdotal evidence of doctors around the country who said, I've used it with azithromycin, with zinc, or with other things, and we had very positive results from that. And that's not a clinical trial. Doctors want to have the clinical trial for sort of the assurance of it. So when doctors say it's unproven, what they're saying, it hasn't been done through a clinical trial yet. But you've got a lot of anecdotal evidence, and that a lot of that anecdotal evidence looks positive. So doctors are using this around the country, and we'll see what happens to it.
And I might just mention, if, again, people go to ipi.org and read it, you've got links to an interview that was done by the ABC affiliate in San Francisco, Channel 7 there, of an individual that has had very good results with it. You have some material from the Wall Street Journal about doctors that have. And so Lynn's raising the other question. People say, oh, that's really dangerous. Well, the bottom line is anything you take has contraindications, just about.
It does.
Having grown up around first a grandfather who's a doctor and a father who's in the pharmaceutical industry, I can guarantee you that's the case. And one of those is heart arrhythmia. One of my Facebook friends was critical of the president for talking about this because he took this because of having malaria, and he had some heart problems. So sometimes that is the case. But to over extrapolate and say this is really dangerous or it's unproven and the president should have never said it, well, that's probably true. But that's another whole story, is that because the president said it, in some respects, the reaction, the overreaction is too great.
Because another thing that's unproven is the social distancing they're imposing on everybody. I am not aware of any clinical trial that says social distancing actually works to mitigate the spread of a disease. Now, it makes perfect sense. It certainly seems reasonable, but we haven't done that through a clinical trial, so that is just as unproven as the hydroxychloroquine.
I was going to mention briefly also, Lynn, there was if you just Google the name Dr. Robin Armstrong, he's a Houston doctor here in the great state of Texas, and he used hydroxychloroquine, prescribed it when he is the doctor who was treating people in a Houston area senior citizen center where they had an outbreak of coronavirus. And he was very much ridiculed by some people in the left-wing press, but he had a very successful outcome for a large number of patients in this facility. And he just talked about the idea he knew about the drug because he has used it to prescribe to other patients for other problems. Lupus is one he recalled. I know malaria has been used for that also. And that I asked him, is this like the first time you can recall in your medical practice where you have political involvement or political kind of interference with your choice of what to prescribe as a doctor? He said, yes, it's that, it was a political interference on the part of people who, in his assessment, didn't really want it to be successful because President Trump said it was successful and therefore they didn't want it to be. But you can, in his case, if you Google that, you'll find many other stories because he talks about where he went to learn about this to be sure he was going to go forward with that prescription.
And Lynn, here's the problem. What you have to do is you have to there are cases that are mild cases, moderate cases, severe cases. There are different doses that you could give of the hydroxychloroquine. And so in the clinical trial, you ask, we're going to take some that are mild, some that are minor, some that are serious. It might work, for instance, on mild cases and not serious. It might work on serious cases and not mild cases. That may be where you see the best reaction. What dosage do you want to give? Some dosages may create some really some really serious reactions.
Sure.
Others may not. So when the media is reporting on this, they almost never get into these minutia of did they use a real strong dose and maybe that actually created a number of complications for the patient, whereas a milder dose may not have, and we just don't know. That's why you want the clinical trial, but you also want to hear what doctors who are practicing in the field are saying.
One other quick point about all this, President Trump was behind in a past, I don't know when it was, but it was this concept of the right to try. This idea if you're very ill. Well, if you are suffering from coronavirus or COVID-19 and there is no vaccine and there is no other recommended medication to bring about the cure, to bring about your recovery, the idea that you're going to not try this if your doctor suggests it and says, and based on my medical training and opinion and experience, I think this is the way to go. I think that's egregious to suggest that it should be ignored by and not used under that general sense of the right to try when there's no other, when this is a lethal disease for some people and there's no other system right now to handle it.
The right to try laws are usually for new drugs, and of course this isn't new, so we know it is generally safe, and doctors can do off-label prescriptions for drugs that is not approved for this, but a doctor has the right to do it for something else.
And I think Lynn has pointed up media bias. MSNBC said, we don't like Trump, so that's that. Well, how about the other media bias? They said the reason the president actually recommended hydroxychloroquine is because he's going to benefit it from financially. And somebody chased that down and said, you have to go through a lot of steps to even find anybody in the Trump administration or anybody in the Trump family that would make more than maybe $1,000 out of this. So it just shows, again, media bias. So read widely. Don't believe everything we have to say. We just gave you some articles to read for yourself, and certainly don't believe everything you hear on CNN or MSNBC, right?
Or NPR. They're another one. Actually, this doctor, I mentioned Dr. Armstrong in Houston, NPR and Rolling Stone went after him. The Rolling Stone, the intellectual magazine, you know them? Yeah. Anyway, went after him for this prescription, basically saying because President Trump said it was great. Now this guy is nuts to prescribe it.
Yep. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
The air is leaking out of the bubble of frustration we've all been living in. There's a national sense of relief as states and localities announce their relaxing lockdowns, quarantines, and social distancing standards. We're anxious to jump back into normal life, also cautious, a bit hesitant. Now that Americans are getting a few more opportunities to try to work again, shop again, pursue recreation in public, and even have elective surgery, some of us are choosy about which of these opportunities to pursue. Political commentator Ben Shapiro wonders if we haven't gotten used to the feeling of safety we've acquired. Or worse, perhaps we as a society, he speculates, have so fundamentally altered our own perception of risk aversion that we aren't willing to leave our houses unless the risk is close to zero. Lots of governors are saying that this is the attitude Americans over 65 or those with certain underlying medical conditions ought to have, at least until phase 3. Stay home, stay safe. But Americans are wise to remember what the lockdowns were for, to flatten the curve. We're going to see second wave spreading of the virus. Ben Shapiro points out that when we emerge from our homes, we will pass the virus to one another again. Americans are doing what Americans are supposed to do. They are assessing risks and benefits, and as the government decides less and less for them, they're deciding for themselves what is best to do and not to do. We'll get help from President Trump's 3 phases of guidelines that are based on how each region of the country does when people start to emerge into society. And more testing will help. Of the plans to open cities and communities, New York Times columnist Russ Dutat writes that each will be its own unique experiment with confounding variables of climate, density, age, and genetics that are nearly impossible to model. Lord, give us wisdom, boldness, and grace. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and I do want to, in just a minute, spend some time both with Dr. Merrill Matthews and Debbie Georgatos, talk about their websites and what's available. So get something to write with if you would need it. I might mention our last article here has to do with the issue of homeschooling. There is an upcoming conference on the Harvard campus to really criticize homeschooling, which has, of course, been taking place right now because everybody is sheltering in place. We'll be talking about that next week. John Zmirak will be with us and a number of other people over time because there's been such a reaction first to the article, which was in the Harvard magazine, and then to this upcoming conference. But I'm going to leave that for next week and instead get to one other issue, and that is when we were talking with Dr. Merrill Matthews, we got the idea that sometimes you have these unintended consequences. And a good example of that has to do with the fact that we now actually pay more people to stay at home than to go and work. And I did mention this in the very first hour, but most of you, of course, did not have a chance to hear that, where I told the story of Jamie Black Lewis. This is in the state of Washington, had 2 spas, was able to get loans through the Paycheck Protection Program, and then went on the Zoom call to tell all of her employees, there's 35 of them in the 2 different spas, that we now will be able to hire you back. And there's, as she said, a firestorm of hatred about that, because they were all upset that they were going to receive more in unemployment benefits than they would have been paid by her. And she said, I can't believe it. On what planet am I competing with unemployment? But probably the best article is the one in Wall Street Journal, where we're now moved to Portland, Oregon, in which Kurt Hoffman, who actually has a number of restaurants and had to lay off. He has a lot of restaurants. So he had 700 people he laid off, but was able then, because of some of the benefits and the fact that he began to realize, wait a minute, we can still do takeout and delivery. So he's trying to hire people back. Nobody wanted to be hired back because, as one individual pointed out, the starting wage for a line cook is $640 a week. Oregon's unemployment offers another $416 per week, but now due this $600 federal bonus, this same worker now would collect over $1,000 a week. Why would you want to go to work for $640 a week when you can stay home for $1,000 a week? And so here's a good example of something that we talked about on this program, because Senator Ben Sasse, along with Lindsey Graham, Tim Scott, Rick Scott, and a few others, at the time said, wait a minute, this CARES Act is going to give people a disincentive not to go back to work.
I love that those senators actually recognized the issue and spoke up at the time, and I'm sure they were roundly ridiculed for being thoughtless and uncaring, and how can you not be on top of, the pain and suffering out there, and that's a ridiculous assumption, but it really is, for many people, it's just kind of human nature. If you're going to earn more by staying home, the idea that you're going to go to work and possibly get exhausted and have to work all day and not like your boss and the idea, and I think there's a duty of elected officials at state level and the federal level to think through the implications of their law, the legislation they're proposing, the policies they're putting in place long term for America. I mean, we were talking about the trend towards socialism under President Obama for 8 years, and how President Trump seemed to right the ship and get us back on the track toward being a free market economy and bringing jobs back and employment back. And this is it's due to a crisis, but it's still, at the end of the day, we're netting out, gets us more back to people staying home, waiting for a check from the government, which is kind of what socialism is kind of unemployment brings. It ultimately brings about that notion of a society where you're no longer connecting hard work with pay, which is one of the basic ideas of freedom and free markets and capitalism.
And of course, at some point you would you feel guilty about taking extra money from the government, but when the government is saying you need to stay home, and now you're going to pay me $1,000 to stay home, and I'd only make maybe $600 if I went back to work, I'm actually benefiting the country by staying home and avoiding going back to work, because that's what the governors are telling me I need to do. So you're actually making it a patriotic thing to do.
But here's the question.
They're real patriots.
Real patriots are sitting home watching Netflix. But Dr. Matthews, this becomes an interesting question, though, going forward. So, okay, at some point we're going to say, you know what, the crisis is past, and coronavirus is, in some way, we're going to stop letting that dictate our policies. So we've got to get back to work. So people are supposed to get up. And so what do you do with the people who say, I'm still afraid, and you made me afraid, all the data you told me, all the stories, you made me afraid, so I can't work anymore. Do we just permanently provide for them?
I think from some politicians' standpoint, the answer is yes, because they've been wanting to get more and more people on the government dole for years. Yes. And so if you're a Democrat pushing this and trying to keep it in place, and you're here, I'm able to sit home, do what I want to, and make a lot more. Who am I going to vote for?
This
is a problem. This is a problem.
And we do seem to have maybe more people in the wagon than are pulling the wagon, right?
Senator Graham. Yeah,
Senator Graham. Well, we're just about out of time here, so let's go around the round table here. And first of all, we've got a picture here of Dr. Merrill Matthews, IPI.org. And we've already mentioned destroying the healthcare system to save it. The world can thank President Trump for the oil deal. physicians still waiting for flexibility in prescribing to suicidal patients, and all the way down to some of the questions that we just mentioned today. But talk about what's available at the website, IPI.
Well, IPI does a range of different public policy things. We've been around for 30-something years now, 37 years, I think. At any rate, so we've been around a long time. We cover a range of different public policy things. We're a nonprofit. Everything is available on the website, free for people to read and share. So IPI.org if you're interested.
And again, we have America Can We Talk. And first of all, even if you would like to not only listen to Point of View, but listen to yours program, you have, of course, not only the live broadcast, but you can go to YouTube, Facebook, and find a lot more. You have a blog. You have all sorts of materials. So, Debbie, talk about what they will find when they land on that website.
So my website is americacanwetalk.org, and I do a show 4 days a week, Monday through Thursday, 3 p.m. Central Time. And I'm always scanning the news in the morning to try to think of the most interesting stories to cover. And I do go to IPI.org, Dr. Matthews' website. IPI.org is great. The great thing about their website is they have everything is factual, logical, and well-researched. It's not one of those websites where you kind of go, gosh, I better double check if this is right. You know it's rock solid. So it's a great website. But for my show, I am entirely dedicated to preserving America. It's the point of doing America Can We Talk. I talk about preserving America, the most extraordinary experiment in human liberty ever to bless this earth. And so I talk about all the things that shape America. Our great guests, I had Gordon Chang on this week talking about China. I had Steve Moore on talking last week about the economic destruction that the shutdown is bringing to America, what to do about it. So we talk about issues in serious, and I've had Dr. Matthews on the show numerous times. I've had Kerby Anderson on the show numerous times. So there you go. So AmericaCanWeTalk.org. You can watch on YouTube, Facebook, all of the podcast aggregators. I love hearing from listeners. And so we have just a great conversation about preserving this country.
And I might just mention you have show highlights, so you can see if you want to watch through the program or fast forward to the part that you want to see. You have the blog, where you have the immunity cards issue. And so all of it, again, is AmericaCanWeTalk.org. Just before we run out of time, let me just mention real quickly, and it will be quick, we opened this opportunity for you today. If you go to the website, pointofview.net, we have a section that says Reopening the Economy. And this is an opportunity for you to write a note to your governor. Maybe you can agree with what he or she is doing, maybe disagree. And we wanted to provide that. We didn't want to have a universal letter because sometimes there are different answers in different states, which we just talked about. But we've made it very easy for you to contact your governor. So go to it and give them a little bit of your thoughts about this very important issue. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes. Have a great weekend, and we will see you back here on Monday right here on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.